Welcome to our first lesson for the spring semester of 2026 in the book of Exodus. Exodus is a very important book for the history of Israel. It shows their beginning as a nation, how God established them, how they were delivered out of Egypt. In the last part of Genesis, we know the story of what happened, how they got into Egypt in the first place with Joseph going in and all the things that he did. But in the history of Egypt, a lot of things took place. And there was a political revival, if you want to call it that, where nationalism, what have you, where Egypt decided that the foreigners were becoming too powerful. And so they started a rule called the Hyksos, 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 where they basically kicked all the foreigners out of the country. And because Israel was growing as much as it had, then Egypt became afraid of the Jews as well. It's estimated that there was probably around 3 million Jews, or maybe even more, who went out of Egypt. And so you can see how the number would have concerned the Egyptians. And so because of that, finally they put them, instead of kicking them out, they put them under slavery and were very, very harsh on them. And so God sent Moses to bring the people out. But we see the judgment of Egypt because of what they did. Egypt was a friend of Israel in the beginning, and in the real sense of the word, because Joseph grows up in the ranks in Egypt, becoming one of the most powerful people in all of Egypt. But after his death, it says there's a new Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. He didn't remember what Joseph had done, how that Joseph had preserved Egypt as a nation. So as time went on, then finally they were put into slavery. And so we have the judgment on Israel, the deliverance of Israel, and the establishment of Israel as finally as a nation that was prophesied back in Genesis 12, Genesis 15, and then fulfilled on entering into the promised land in the days of the book of Joshua. Events here took place around 1446 BC to 1406 BC. Now, I'm very strongly opinionated about using the phrase BC. This is what has historically been used. It means before Christ. AD means Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. And this was the way that the United States and many other countries had kept records for centuries. Now there's a new, well, it's not new, but it's brought up, instead of using AD and BC, they use CE and BCE. The CE, they say, stands for Common Era, and the BCE is before the Common Era. Well, the only problem with that, if you ask them to find what the Common Era is, they would have to finally conclude, well, the Common Era was at the time of Christ. And what's before Common Era was before Christ. So why change it? I mean, it's only because they want to deny Jesus Christ. It's only because the world is so anti-Christian right now that they readily accept this new terminology. It's disgusting to me how ridiculous people can be in their hatred of Jesus Christ, and therefore, because they hated him first, they hate us as well. But that's all right. I mean, we've got to do what God wants to do. If the world hates us, we still got to do the right thing. This is wrote after the completion of the tabernacle, so this is after they got into the promised land on the wilderness journey, right at the very beginning of it. But when God gave the instructions for the tabernacle, then God had Moses write down the events here in this book. depression took place because Exodus 1:8 says, "And knew Pharaoh who did not know Joseph." And as I said, because of the great population of the of Israelites, Jews at that time, they became a security risk. At least the Egyptians saw them as a security risk. That doesn't mean that they were, but that's how the Egyptians saw them. And so they became very hard on them. They were greatly oppressed because of that. The nature of the oppression, of course, was bitter service. In chapter 1, verse 10 through 14, they were very hard upon them, giving them tasks that they could have done easier in one way, but the Egyptians made it hard on them just to be oppressed. And of course, then we have the sad story of the deciding that let's kill the Hebrew babies, let's kill the boys. A mass murder, genocide upon the Jews, because that way figured if they don't have any sons, then they can't reproduce, and if the girls reproduce, it's probably through a Egyptian baby, not a Hebrew baby. So we claim them as our own and raise them as our own. We would own them at that point. And so again, just a very cruel attitude. I know what we see in this country today, in the world today, we see a lot of cruel, vicious attitudes, wickedness going on in the world today, and it just makes you sick to your stomach. But the reality of it is, it's been bad in other centuries as well. I mean, can you imagine if the country today decided to kill the firstborn of everybody, kill the boy? I mean, it's just beyond our imagination, I hope. But maybe it's not. Maybe it will happen. It's happened before. It can happen again. The Holocaust happened. It's over 6 million Jews and untold number of gypsies and prisoners of war. I mean, Russia alone lost 25 million people in World War II. If that happened before, it can happen again, and I can see us being on the verge of war. This country, I don't think, would survive it because we don't have any unity. We're not a United States anymore. We're divided by political party, not even really divided by beliefs as much as we are by political party. People follow the political party because the political party told them to, not because they believe that way. And it's on both sides, Republicans and Democrats. I mean, we're living in a very sad day and age where people don't think for themselves. They're just a bunch of lemmings that follow after what their chosen leader says. And our chosen leader should be Jesus Christ, and we wouldn't have to worry about these things. But we see these things going on. Then we have the Prince of Egypt, Exodus 2 through 4. We're talking about Moses here. The birth in Exodus chapter 2, there went a man of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. Now she hides him 3 months because of the decree to kill the male child. She already has 2 other children, Miriam and Aaron, Moses' older sister and older brother. But the rule went into effect after their births. And so now this Levite, and it's significant that it's house of Levi, because later on this, of course, would be the priestly tribe. And you had to be a descendant of the Kohathites, which we'll see that name pop up here in a minute, but the father of Moses was a Kohath, and then today that would be Cohen, C-O-H-E-N, and maybe some other variations of that name as well, in this country at least. And then, of course, the priests come not through Moses, but through Aaron. Of course, Moses' mother and father were devastated by the decree. Didn't want to give up their child, but knew that if they kept their child, after about 3 months, they were fortunate in their own eyes that Moses had not been discovered at this point. And so they decided the best thing to do is send the child away, and they made a little ark. It's not like Noah's ark, of course, but Moses' ark, a little basket that they would put into the water. Now, that in itself is very dangerous, hard thing to do, but they trusted God. They trusted the Lord would take care, and they didn't know how, they didn't know what was going to happen, but they trusted that God knew best. One of the cities in Egypt is called Crocodilopolis. Crocodilopolis. Why? Because of the number of crocodiles. So the waters were infested with crocodiles. So putting Moses in this little ark here wasn't the wisest thing in the world to do by our standards. Now God, again, knows what he's doing, so God interceded in this situation here. And I love the story of what happened, how that God used Moses' sister Miriam in really just a great way, in Miriam's eyes, a normal way, but in God's sight, a miraculous way, is that Miriam's own childish curiosity was fixed upon her little baby brother and saw him put in this ark by Moses' mother and father, and Jochebed and Amram, who were part of the Kohathites, line of Kohath. But her childish curiosity watching her brothers, God used that in a way that delivered Israel out of captivity. Humanly speaking, now we know God is always the one who gets credit for everything, but humanly speaking, what Miriam did here saved the nation of Israel. Not by her means, but by God using her in that miraculous way. When she could not longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. So there in the weeds, there by the river, she decided, I don't know what to do. And you can imagine how her and her husband felt. I can imagine the number of tears that were shed, the anguish, the screams, the cries over their little baby that in their eyes now would be gone forever. Just very, very devastating. But the child was watched by Miriam. As the little basket, little ark floated down to the river, Miriam says, kept a watch. I can see this little girl who's watching her parents devastated by the loss of her brother. And her own curiosity, childish curiosity, and her own empathy for her little brother and for her mother and father. How that she would watch the ark as it floated down. And it wasn't long before it was spotted. Sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. So he stood off and watched. Didn't know that what she was about to do would change history. God placed Miriam in the right place at the right time. It doesn't take great intelligence, it doesn't take great strength, it doesn't take great talent, it doesn't take any of those things to be used by God. It takes a willingness to be used. I have no great abilities. I wish I could sing. I wish I was musical. I wish I could play a piano or violin or a saxophone or something. I have no abilities whatsoever. I'm not an artist. I can't paint anything. I can't make anything of any value. I could dabble a bit in woodworking, but what I make, nobody cares about. It's just something for me to do at times. But I wouldn't call it art. And at times it's frustrating to me. Wish I had talent. But the one thing I can do, and the only thing that God holds me accountable for, is that I can be available. I can be available to God. If I'm available to Him, then God can accomplish great things through me. I won't get credit for Him because I don't need credit for Him. I don't deserve credit for Him. If anything happens, God deserves all the credit. I get tired of hearing people talking about what they do for the Lord and how they did this and they do that, and if it wasn't for me, and so-and-so wouldn't even be saved, or so-and-so's marriage would be all falling apart if I hadn't intervened, and taking all the credit for everything, when the reality of it is, anything that's accomplished, God gets the credit for it. What Miriam did here was make herself available, and in my eyes became a heroine. She deserves praise for simply doing and being where God wanted her to be, at the right place at the right time. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maiden walked along by the river's side. When she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse a child for thee?" Now I love this. When Pharaoh's daughter recognized that this was a Jewish boy, Hebrew boy, then said his sister, Miriam was watching. Now, Pharaoh's daughter had not had a child. She could not nurse the baby. Her attendants apparently had not had children. They couldn't nurse the baby. And so they knew they somehow had to feed this baby. And so Miriam steps in and says, "Oh, by the way, I think I know somebody that can help you out in this situation. Shall I go call for the nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" She didn't say, "My mom can nurse him because that's my brother." What she simply said, "I know somebody that can nurse the baby." And Pharaoh's daughter apparently knew that that was a great idea and allowed it to happen. Abraham and Jochebed gave up Moses, but then God blessed them with much more. If we give ourselves to God and forsake all else, we actually end up with far more. I know that the anguish of Amram and Jochebed had to be great. Had to be. We think we're sacrificing to God, but we receive much more than we give. Our choices in life, our path may be that we want to accomplish this or accomplish that in life. But then we decide to follow the Lord into the ministry. And God gives us far more than we could have ever think that we accomplished in life. Because in our minds, we think, well, I could have done this, I could have been great at that. And the reality of it is you might have failed at that. I mean, it's easy to say what we think we could have done, but the reality of that is something else. If we follow God, choose the path that God has for us, and no matter what's going on around us, no matter who opposes us, we stay true to what God wants. Don't let man deter us from that. Don't let man keep us from serving God in the place where God has called us to be. We've got to do the right thing no matter what happens. And if there's problems, we need to face them and still do the right thing. Not only did Amram and Jochebed give up Moses, But then God blessed them by allowing them to raise up their son anyway, and to get paid for it. I mean, most historians believe they probably raised him to around the age of 5 or so. That was a normal weaning age at that time. And so Moses stayed with his parents up to that age. Therefore, knowing, that who his mother was in a very personal way, God worked it out. If Jochebed and Amram had decided to keep Moses, they may have lost Moses. He may have been executed, not only the baby, but they themselves. And look what God did. Pharaoh's daughter said, "Go." And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I'll give thee thy wages." And the woman took the child and nursed it. So can you imagine the anguish that they felt when they put Moses in the water? And now the jubilation they felt when not only they got their own child back, but they publicly can display that child without any fear of anybody harming that child, and they were paid wages for it. So God has a way of doing things that we can't even imagine. Sometimes we pray for things and pray and tell God how they should happen. And, I don't know what Amram and Jochebed prayed when they put Moses in the little ark, but probably just prayed for his safety, prayed that he would get away somewhere and someone find him and raise him as their own. And probably thought that would be the greatest thing that could ever happen, is if somebody would find Moses and raise him as their own. But God answered it in a more spectacular way. Let's leave the answering to God. Pray the prayer that you need to pray, but leave the answering to God. Of course, chapter 2, as Moses grows up, he's now around 40 years old. And we see the story of what happens where he ends up killing an Egyptian. And then his flight, his escape to Midian. Even though Moses was raised by Pharaoh's daughter, he knew that the Egyptians were hard on his people. He knew his mother and father. He knew Miriam and Aaron, his brother, grew up like that. It wasn't that he was, one day God gave him special revelation, "Oh, by the way, you're a Hebrew." He would have known this his whole life. But one day he just couldn't take it any longer when he saw the Egyptian beating the Hebrew. So he steps in. Came to pass in those days when Moses grown that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way. When he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together and said unto him that did the wrong, "Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? Why'd you kill him?" I mean, here's 2 Hebrews make the accusation to Moses. And he said, "Who made thee a prince and judge over us? And intendest thou to kill me as thou killed the Egyptian?" And Moses feared and said, "Surely this thing is none." Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So here Moses in his anger, right, wrong, whatever he did, was it justifiable? We don't know. All we know is what happened. And God takes care of the circumstances surrounding that. And of all people to expose Moses, it was 2 Hebrew men. And yet, Moses probably needed to be exposed, because God would take him out of the land for 40 years and give him a good education in God's ways and send him back home to let Yeah, back on, let the people let go. So he flees to Midian. Events that seem accidental just very well may be guided by the hands of God. When I first got saved, living in West Virginia, went to a small church in Sophia, West Virginia, and it was dating this girl. Went to church on Saturday night. There was a play called One Night I Dreamed I Saw Heaven. And thought I would end up marrying this girl. I didn't know what love was, didn't know much about anything at that point, to be honest with you. But I thought I'd end up marrying her. And went to her house the next morning to go to church with her and her family. And her sister let me in. And as I was going in the house, I heard the girl that I was dating, I'm yelling, frustrated over something, I don't know what it was. And they said something about I was there, and I don't remember the words now, but some effect that she said some very negative things about me, and I don't know why that hit me as hard as it did. At the point I didn't know why it hit me as hard as it did, but it made me just turn around and walk out. And I walked out and never went back. It was hard on me for a while because I thought this was my one chance in life to have somebody. And so it was a very, very difficult thing for me. But God used that in my life to show that I needed a change from where I was at. And God directed me from West Virginia down to North Carolina, where it gave me an opportunity to go to a Bible college and start studying the Bible on my own, more importantly than anything else. If it had not been for that incident that Sunday morning, my life might have been completely different than what it is. And I can't imagine it being better. I can only imagine it being far worse. As I matured and grew up, not only spiritually, but just mentally, I realized that I was in a horrible situation in the first place, and it would not have lasted. A very toxic situation in my life. And as I matured in the Lord, I realized, that God knew exactly what He was doing. That God allowed me to be at that place at that time to get saved. Then He allowed me to be in a place where it would cause me to depart from where I was at and just forsake everything. Just get in my car and come down to North Carolina because of family down here. But God used all that in His way. I could not have planned that. Never thought that would be what would happen in life. But God knew exactly what He was doing. So events that seem accidental very well might be the hand of God getting us out of a bad situation into a great situation. We went to Midian, and the Midianites actually were descendants of Abraham and held the same beliefs as the Jews did. Oftentimes we just think of the Hebrews as being the chosen people of Israel, and they were the only ones with salvation. But that actually wasn't true. There were other peoples that believed the truth. They weren't Jews because there were no Jews at this point. They had the Hebrew line, and then you had the line of Abraham, which through one son was the Hebrew line. But if you remember later on, after Sarah died, Abraham remarried. He married a woman by the name of Keturah, Keturah. And through her, they had a child, and one of the descendants was the Midianites. And so God directed Moses out of Egypt to a people that had the beliefs that Moses needed. A woman he met, Zipporah, and her father, Jethro. Moses ended up marrying Zipporah, sometimes spelled Sephorah. Sephora, Sephora. If you ever watch the movie The Ten Commandments, that's how they spell it in Ten Commandments, is Sephora. In the Bible, it spells it Zipporah, same name, different spelling. Who was a daughter of Jethro, and Moses ends up living the next 40 years as a shepherd. So raised in the palace, but now ends up being a shepherd, serving God in the way that God would have him, and learning what God would have him to learn until the time was right for God to use Moses to let the people go. All right, we'll talk more about this next week.